Is the department ready to call its next witness?
Yes, we are. Glenn Pacheco, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Pacheco.
Good afternoon.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Just remind you to speak into the mic.
Good afternoon, sir. Would you state your name?
Glenn Pacheco,
Where are you employed, sir?
the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection.
And what, at what address?
1 Winter Street, Boston, 02108.
Have you submitted pre-filed testimony in this matter
Yes. Yes.
on behalf of the department?
Yes,
Do you have a copy of your pre-filed testimony
I
with you?
I do.
And you've also included some rebuttal testimony as well as supplemental testimony, is that fair to say?
Correct.
Have you signed all of those pieces of testimony under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I have.
Do you wish to make any changes to any of those items?
I do not.
Do you now adopt your pre-filed testimony, rebuttal testimony, and supplemental testimony for purposes of this hearing?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Pacheco is available for cross-examination.
Oh. Sorry. Good afternoon, Mr. Pacheco.
Good afternoon.
I'll start by what I said to the last witness, which is, we know the department staff are very busy, and we appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you.
If you could please keep your voice up.
I'm sorry. I will do my best. Can we start by going to paragraph 13 of your pre-filed written testimony? Okay. This is the paragraph where you talk about air toxics modeling, is that correct?
That is correct.
And in the last sentence of that paragraph, you wrote, correct me if I read it wrong, consistent with MassDEP's longstanding air toxics model and practice, emissions from nearby significant sources and background concentrations were not considered in the analysis. Did I read that correctly, sir?
Yes, you did.
Okay. When you refer to the longstanding air toxics model and practice, can you refer me to any specific regulations, guidance, or other written documents that set forth that longstanding practice?
The only one I can point you to is the 1989 document.
Just to make sure we're on the same page, that's the Exhibit 4 that was attached to Mr. Keith's pre-filed testimony?
I believe so.
Okay. Actually, let's pass a copy of this. I'm going to pass you up a document if you could confirm that that's what you're referring to.
It looks like it.
Okay. Can we mark that for identification? I just want to have a clean record on this. I'm sorry. It's for everyone else's identification, it's to the thing of that.
So this will be marked for ID 25.
And sitting here today, just to be clear, you're not aware of any other written document in any form of MassDEP that explicitly sets forth that long-standing protocol. Is that correct, sir?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
No worries. Yep. Just to confirm then, sitting here today, you're not aware of any other document in MassDEP that sets forth that long-standing protocol, correct? Explicitly.
That is correct.
In connection with this proceeding, I don't want to know anything that you talk about with counsel, but in connection with this proceeding, did you research or look for any such documents?
I did not.
Can you move to paragraph 27 of your rebuttal testimony? very last paragraph. So, is it fair, you're correct, to characterize this testimony as saying you did not require modeling of startups or shutdowns because you viewed them as an intermittent emission condition? Have I stated that?
You stated that correctly.
Okay. And you provide us a link in there, and it appears, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you relied on a 1 hour NO2 standard from US EPA, is that correct?
That is a piece of guidance that we do rely on, particularly for 1 hour NO2.
Okay.
For what?
1 hour NO2 model.
We can agree that NO2 is a different compound than formaldehyde, for example, correct?
Correct.
Did you interact, no, you're aware that Algonquin, Enbridge, one of the two, I'm not sure which, retained Trinity consultants as their air dispersion modeling experts in this
Yes.
case? Okay. And did you personally interact with members of Trinity in connection with this?
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, who was it?
As alluded to by Mr. Fiskus, who admitted that he didn't start at the beginning of the process. I was there for the whole process. If my memory serves me correctly, the first person that I interacted with was a modeler by the name of Susan Barnes. Don't know what happened to her. And then at some point I started interacting with, I believe her name is Kristen Davies. And then that led to Justin Fiskus.
All right. I'm not trying to make this a memory test.
No, I just, that does go back to 2015.
Fair enough. Were you involved in the discussions with Trinity concerning modeling of air toxics? If there were any discussions.
Yeah, I mean, there were discussions.
And was it MassDEP that suggested to Trinity that air toxics should be modeled?
Yes.
And in the course of those discussions, did Trinity or anyone at Enbridge or Algonquin ever suggest that startups should be modeled as part of that modeling?
Can you repeat that?
I'm sorry.
It's okay, I just want to make sure I get it.
No, I understand. I'm not trying to be I'm happy to repeat anything. In the course of those discussions,
Right.
so MassDEP's talking
Mhm.
to Enbridge, Algonquin, Trinity. Did anyone at Trinity, Algonquin, or Enbridge, so outside of MassDEP, suggest to MassDEP that you should include startup emissions as part of that modeling?
No.
Okay. You reviewed Mr. Fickus's pre-filed and rebuttal testimony.
I have.
You understand then that he has done some modeling on a 9-minute, an 18-minute, and an annualized startup scenario.
Yes, I am aware of it.
You're aware that the modeled concentrations for formaldehyde went up at certain receptor sites as a result of that modeling, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Do you yourself know why formaldehyde is emitted at a higher emission factor during the startup cycle for this turbine?
Well, I couldn't add anything to what's already been testified on that subject matter. I mean, if you're looking for additional information.
No, I'm just trying to understand what you yourself understand. So let's actually.
My understanding is consistent with what I've heard here today from Mr. Goodrich and Mr. Fiskus.
Did you know that, so before this proceeding,
Mhm.
when you were talking to Enbridge and Algonquin and Trinity, did you have that understanding at the time?
Can you read?
Yeah, So let's go back in time
Yeah,
a little
go-
bit, to before this proceeding. I'm just trying to establish, I know you understand it today.
Mhm.
Back then, when you were in those discussions about doing the air dispersion modeling that ended up in the 2018 air dispersion modeling report, in that time period, did you understand why formaldehyde may result, what formaldehyde does result? Strike that. Why there's more formaldehyde emitted during a startup cycle than during normal operations?
Yes, I was aware of that.
Okay. And how were you aware of that at the time? Is that just something you knew?
Let him
Yeah,
finish his question, please.
No, go ahead, if you understood my question, yeah, go ahead.
I knew that, I would call that, general professional knowledge. When you have certain type of air pollution control devices that rely on a temperature in a catalyst bed or that type of control, there is usually a period of time where before that control gets to its operating set point, you would have higher emissions. So yes, I'm definitely aware of that general principle.
Are you aware that MassDEP issued a draft plan approval as part of this permitting process?
Yes,
And you're also aware then that there was a public comment period in connection with that, correct?
yes.
I want to make this a memory test, so I'm going to pass up to you actually a copy of that. So everyone, this is one of the basic documents, it's the comments and the responses. So, 1 second, and I'll give you a reference point just for this report. So if you could flip to comment 19. Say in that comment that at least one commenter noted for MassDEP that there were 416 startups and shutdowns listed in the non-major comprehensive plan application for this project.
Correct.
And that commenter suggested that MassDEP may want to consider that in terms of its modeling, correct?
Correct.
MassDEP, do you have any reason to dispute the response that's in this that came from MassDEP?
What was the basic question?
I'll restate it. That's fair. Do you agree with what's written in that response?
I generally agree.
Okay, you say you generally agree. Are there specific points of disagreement that you have? Actually, strike that. Let's start with, were you involved in preparing that response?
I don't think I was. I mean, I'm not recognizing the words as my written words.
Fair enough, fair enough. But you were the environmental, is it type of environmental consultant? Is that right?
My title here is environmental analyst.
Analyst. You were the environmental analyst who was responsible for the air dispersion modeling for this project, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So then, I'll recognize it, but you just reviewed it now. You said you generally agree with it. Do you have any specific points of disagreement with it?
Perhaps I should have said I agree with it.
Fair, that's why I gave you the opportunity. I want to make sure we're getting full and accurate. If you need more time to look at it,
No.
don't hesitate to tell me. But you have to submit. A couple more questions and then I'll be done. So as part of this proceeding, you're aware that John Hinckley submitted pre-filed direct one document, pre-filed direct and rebuttal testimony.
Yes,
Okay, you reviewed that?
I did.
Okay. You're also aware that Justin Fickus submitted 2 documents now, pre-filed direct and rebuttal testimony, correct?
Correct.
You reviewed that too?
I read his testimony and I reviewed his exhibits.
Okay. Something you didn't review?
I believe we have modeling files.
Okay.
I think the modeling files.
I got you. So
I
yeah.
have not
That's
looked at them.
So you reviewed, that. I understand what you're getting at. So with the rebuttal testimony, you received electronic data modeling files. Am I getting that correct?
I believe we did.
Okay, and you haven't reviewed those?
I have not.
Okay, fair enough. So you've seen the results of Mr. Hinckley's models that include startup emissions, correct?
Yes.
You've seen the results of Mr. Fickus's startup models.
Yes.
Okay. Just one final question. The department, at least in your testimony, you offer no opinion from the department on that subsequent modeling, do you?
I don't believe I did.
Nothing further, Mr. Bertram.
Mr. Hayden, Mr. Goldrosen.
I have just a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll remind you to please keep your voice up.
Good afternoon, Mr. Pacheco. Thank you for being here. And I don't know if you've been here the whole way, but if you have,
I have.
you've been here a long time. Going back to your direct testimony at paragraph 13. In the last sentence of that, you, as others have done, refer to DEP's long-standing air toxic modeling practice. So I will ask you, as I asked the previous witness, what is your understanding of the rationale for that policy, or that practice?
Well, I think what's central to the rationale is that it's a policy that's meant to look at the incremental risk of a proposed facility, proposed emission source.
And why, what is your understanding of the rationale for not considering background concentration?
I haven't participated in any discussions on pros and cons of doing that.
Fair enough. We could turn to your rebuttal testimony. Go to paragraph 25. My questions are really going to pertain to paragraph 22 through 25, dealing with modeling for shoreline and or sea breeze fumigation.
Sure, sure.
So in paragraph 25, you be clear, the modeling you did or the iterations of air screen that DEP did occurred after the petitioners had submitted their direct pre-filed testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And were you personally involved in that?
Yes,
All right.
yes, I was.
Thank you. So Trinity was not requested to do such modeling during the course of its work on this project. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Were there ever any discussions with Trinity about performing such modeling?
No,
Were there any discussions within the department as to whether such modeling should be done?
no.
Whose responsibility would it have been within the department to request or require, perhaps maybe the proper word, Trinity, to undertake this modeling?
That would be my responsibility.
And you did not think it was necessary to do so?
That is correct.
That is all I have.
Mr. Rothschild, may I have 30 seconds? I just need to get up and ask one person one question.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Rothschild.
You're welcome. Mr. Hayden.
Good afternoon, Mr. Pacheco.
Good afternoon.
You mentioned in your testimony a few minutes ago having had initial conversations with Susan Barnes at Trinity Consultants.
I believe that was her name.
I have an email correspondence between you both that I'd like to ask you about. There's one for the witness, one for Mr. Rothschild, and copies going around the table. Number 26, thank you. Everyone ready?
Not yet.
Mr. Hayden, are you still at paragraph 25?
Well, this was just in follow-up to the witness's testimony earlier about his conversation with Ms. Barnes.
Okay.
If that arose out of 25, then yes. So that. Good. Mr. Pacheco, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
What do you recognize it to be?
Apparently I had a conversation with Ms. Barnes and followed up with this email, providing her meteorological data to use and giving her guidance, or actually giving her the actual background numbers to use in the modeling analysis for criteria pollutants.
Did you exchange this correspondence with Ms. Barnes in your capacity with the department
I did.
and concerning the project at issue in this appeal?
Can you repeat that?
Was this email regarding the project at issue in this appeal?
Yes.
I would offer this into evidence.
Any objection? So admitted.
Thank you.
What number is it?
26.
Just a few more questions about the document, sir.
Sure.
Your first sentence references a conversation the week prior.
Correct, I said I had talked to her.
And so that would be roughly the week of July 13, 2015?
Yes?
Do you remember when you first got involved concerning this project?
Oh, it's generally right around that time,
And you've attached MET data?
meteorological data.
Thank you. And looking at the paragraph below the data that you've included in this email, would you read that first sentence for us?
For a first tier, single value approach to applying background concentrations, please use the following data derived from data recorded over the latest 3-year period from 2012 to 2014
Background concentrations of what?
of what we refer to as the criteria pollutants, carbon monoxide, NO2, PM 2.5, PM 10, SO2.
So that's standard operating procedure for an applicant to include background concentrations of criteria pollutants in performing their air dispersion model.
That's correct.
Now, the paragraph that's below the data, could you read that first sentence?
Should you require further refinement to your background concentration, especially for the 1 hour NO2, let me know so we can provide the data. We
And-
don't-
That's all we need. What are you referring to when you state further refinement?
In the first sentence you asked me to read, I used the term first tier. You'll find that term in the Appendix W. The further refinement would have been the second tier, which, and the data I'm referring to is just our hourly NO2 data that would be collected at one of our air monitoring stations. The expectation would be that they would process it, the applicant, in a format that would be suitable to use in what we call time of day by season format.
Just so our record's clear, when you refer to Appendix W, are you referring to the EPA guideline on air quality models?
Correct.
And Mr. Fickus quoted language from that Appendix W in his rebuttal testimony. Do you recall that?
Sure he did. Yeah.
Let me read you a sentence from that Appendix W and let me know if you recognize it. Rather, the identification of nearby sources to be explicitly modeled is regarded as an exercise of professional judgment to be accomplished jointly by the applicant and the appropriate reviewing authority.
Yes, I recognize that.
Okay. And is that what you're doing here? You're discussing nearby sources and how to explicitly model them?
I'm going to use the word again, generally. Generally, yes. I mean, that's, in this particular correspondence, we are actually not talking about nearby sources. We are talking about background air quality levels.
Fair enough. Let me show you another email where I believe you are talking about nearby sources. So again, Mr. Pacheco, if you could pass one over to Ms. Rothschild. Mr. Dingle, Mr. Fallon, just let me know when you've had a chance and you're ready. Mr. Pacheco, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
And what do you recognize it to be?
Email correspondence between the department and Christine Davies of Trinity. It's an email thread that ended with my direct correspondence with Ms. Davies.
And that's in your capacity as a department employee
Yes,
and in connection with the project that's subject of this appeal.
yes.
I offer this as the next exhibit.
Any objection? It's admitted. Exhibit 27.
Now, Mr. Pacheco, I want to be fair to you, and I believe you've already noticed where you entered this email chain.
Yes. Yep.
So you sent the email on the top of the first page of Exhibit 27 to Ms. Davies and Ms. Barnes, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And that was following some email correspondence that originally included Mr. Cushing and Ms. Davies, and then Mr. Cushing CC'd you to loop you into the email chain. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And when the section chief CCs you into an email chain, do you read the email history so that you understand the background?
Absolutely.
So you were familiar with the original email correspondence between Ms. Davies and Mr. Cushing?
Yes.
And would you read that email that Ms. Davies sent to Mr. Cushing, please?
Tom, we are rolling right along on preparing the application for the Weymouth compressor station for Spectra. One of our modelers has been in contact with Glenn Pacheco, and he has provided the metadata and background data that we need, as well as information on the protocol that we will need to submit. However, he said you guys had not discussed what the modeling would need. Sorry. However, he said you guys had not yet discussed what modeling would need to be submitted with the application. I know there was some preliminary discussion during the pre-application meeting, and then in parentheses, attended by Wendy Mertz from Trinity, about what modeling would be required, but I wanted to make sure we are on the same page as to what you would like to see submitted with the application. Here are my initial questions, and then there's a list of 4 questions. Number 1, are you concerned about only nitrogen oxides? Or do you want to see something for other pollutants? 2, can we do screen modeling, i.e. air screen? 3, do we need to include any nearby sources? If so, can the DEP provide the inventory data, or do we need to get that from someone else? 4, in the application, do you want to see the modeling results compared to the NACs or the modeled pollutant?
That's good.
It didn't sound right to me when I read it, but that's
fine.
That's what she
And
said.
there's a conclusory paragraph, a concluding paragraph, but the questions I have to follow up with you on, you've already read for us. The second sentence that you read states one of our modelers has been in contact with Glenn Pacheco. Who was that was in contact with you?
Susan Barnes.
And is that referring back to the first email we looked at?
Yeah, yes,
And Ms. Davies advises Mr. Cushing that you provided the metadata. Again, that refers back to the first email we looked at.
yes.
The next sentence states, he said, and please correct me if you have a different interpretation of this email, but I believe that he said is referring to you. He said you guys had not yet discussed what modeling would need to be submitted with the application.
I would agree that that's referring to me.
Okay. Did you tell Ms. Barnes that you had not yet discussed what modeling would need to be submitted with the application?
I honestly don't remember my discussions with her from 2015. I would have to infer that I had not.
Fair. Asked a different way, do you have any reason sitting here in 2019 to dispute that statement in this email?
No,
The next sentence describes some preliminary discussion during the pre-application meeting about what modeling would be required. Did you attend that meeting?
I don't remember. I did attend at least one pre-application meeting, and I just don't remember.
When Mr. Cushing forwarded this email to you, replied to Ms. Davies and CC'd you on this email, what did he say?
I'm sorry?
Sure, I'm following the email chain up. So on Monday, July 27, 2015, at 4:21 p.m., Section Chief Cushing sent an email to Christine Davies and CC'd you, correct?
Correct.
And what did Section Chief Cushing say?
For the modeling, I would like to see a demonstration of compliance with all NAC standards. For questions 2 and 3, Mr. Pacheco will be able to provide the answer.
So what questions were you asked by the Section Chief to provide the answer to?
2 and 3.
And what are those questions?
Reread the questions.
Please.
Can we do screening, modeling, i.e. air screen? Do we need to include any nearby sources? If so, can the DEP provide the inventory data, or do we need to get that from somewhere else?
So now have we gotten into the area where you're falling into the Appendix W guidelines from EPA to identify nearby sources with the applicant to be explicitly modeled?
Yes,
And you replied to Ms. Davies and Ms. Barnes, correct?
correct,
On July 28, 2015 at 9:45 a.m.
correct.
What did you say?
In response to item 2, question 2, air screen is acceptable if you can show compliance. In response to 3, question 3, until you do preliminary modeling and report back to me or state in protocol, it's not clear that cumulative modeling, inclusion of nearby in parentheses, I say inclusion of nearby interacting sources, close parenthesis, is required. There is a power plant in close proximity to your proposed location, so if significant impact levels, cells, are exceeded for any pollutant averaging period from your project's impacts, then your modeling demonstration will have to include at least that facility. I'm not sure about any other sources at this point. MassDEP will provide the stack parameters and emission rates for any nearby sources required in the modeling.
And in the first email we looked at, you had already given her background concentrations for criteria pollutants, correct?
Yes,
So we're talking about information in addition to that in this July 28th email.
yes,
And you state in your email to Ms. Davies and Ms. Barnes that if stated in the applicant's protocol, they can include modeling of nearby sources, correct?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure, could we have the question right back, please?
And you state in your email to Ms. Davies and Ms. Barnes that if stated in the applicant's protocol, they can include modeling of nearby sources, correct?
Yes,
And you do not advise Ms. Davies and Ms. Barnes in this email that that cumulative modeling of nearby sources is not required.
I do not tell her that it's not required.
And when the applicant prepared their initial air dispersion modeling, there were exceedances of significant impact levels, correct?
Correct.
And in this email, that means, you're stating that means their air dispersion modeling has to at least include the power plant in close proximity to the compressor station's proposed locations.
Correct.
And you say you're not sure about any other sources at that point.
That's what I state on July 28th.
And there's nothing that prohibits the applicant at this stage from considering nearby sources of air toxics to be explicitly modeled in their air dispersion model.
Objection.
Basis.
I don't understand.
Could you read the question back, please?
And there is nothing that prohibits the applicant at this stage from considering nearby sources of air toxics to be explicitly modeled in their air dispersion model.
I'll sustain that objection. I'm not really sure I understand that.
Okay, fair enough. Mr. Pacheco, if the applicant stated in its protocol that it intended to model nearby sources of air toxics, that's something the department would have accepted, correct?
So can you repeat it?
Sure. If we could have the question read back, please.
Mr. Pacheco, if the applicant stated in its protocol that it intended to model nearby sources of air toxics, that's something the department would have accepted, correct?
I think that that would have resulted in a discussion within the department.
Fair enough. And in the question 3 that we already read, you were answering for consultants retained by the applicant as to whether they need to include any nearby sources, correct?
I'm sorry.
Sure. I'm referring back to that question 3 where there was a list of 4 questions.
Yep.
Question 3, up through the first question mark, asks, do we need to include any nearby sources?
But what are you asking?
Whether you were answering that question for the consultant retained by the applicant.
Yes.
And that question can include air toxics, correct?
It could, but at this point in the discussion, that was a question that I took to mean criteria pollutants.
But sitting here today, you agree that that question could include air toxics?
When the question's being asked, I mean, I don't know what's on the person's mind when they're writing the question. So when you think of it that way, yes, it could have included air toxics.
Were you involved in any conversations with the applicant or its contractors concerning the question of whether or not to model air toxics from nearby sources?
I'm sorry, I have to ask again. Can you?
Sure.
It's the beginning part of the question.
That's okay. Could we have it read back, please?
Were you involved in any conversations with the applicant or its contractors concerning the question of whether or not to model air toxics from nearby sources?
I was involved in discussions with the applicant after they had been asked to model air toxics.
And when was that?
To the best of my recollection, that would have been late 2015, early 2016.
So my question pertained to modeling nearby sources of air toxics, correct?
Correct.
And you were involved in conversations about that after the applicant was asked to model air toxics?
Correct.
And who was involved in those conversations?
With the applicant?
The conversations you're describing, right?
Well, let's clarify what discussions he's talking about before you assume he's taking that particular tack. Can you ask a different question?
If you
please?
could break that down, there were multiple discussions, it sounds like.
Okay.
If you could probe that serially.
Sure, let's go chronologically. when was the first time you discussed air toxics with the applicant?
After we had decided to ask them to model air toxics.
And how did you reach that decision?
My understanding, now that wasn't my decision. My understanding is that we had I believe we had received comments at that point in the process, and our permit chief had decided that air toxic modeling would be appropriate.
And was there discussion before the instruction to the applicant was made concerning air toxics about whether the department would also require modeling of air toxics from nearby sources?
Yes.
And what did that discussion consist of?
That discussion primarily, if my memory serves me correctly, began late 2015, early 2016 time period, I believe. The primary point of discussion was what air toxics to model.
And as it pertains to nearby sources, what did that discussion include?
I don't believe that discussion took place because we don't normally, no, I strike that. We don't require background sources to be modeled for air toxics.
Okay. I might have misunderstood your testimony.
Okay.
A moment ago, I thought you said in having this conversation with the section chief, there was conversation about whether or not to require the applicant to model nearby sources of air toxics.
I misunderstood the question. The conversation was whether to require the applicant to model air toxics for the proposed facility as part of our incremental risk policy.
And in that conversation, is it your memory there was no discussion whatsoever between anyone from the department as to whether to require the applicant to model air toxics from nearby sources?
That's correct.
And when you communicated this information to the applicant, was there any conversation with the applicant about whether or not to model air toxics from nearby sources?
I don't remember.
Were you the person that delivered the instruction to the applicant to model air toxics?
Again, I don't remember. I'm not having selective memory here. I mean, I don't remember whether I sent the email or whether Tom sent the email. It could have been either one of us. Oftentimes it is me.
If I could turn your attention to your pre-filed direct your pre-filed direct testimony, paragraph 3. You make a statement that you routinely participate in meetings and calls with air dispersion modeling experts in other states and EPA.
Correct.
What other states do you have those meetings and calls with?
Well, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts DEP is a member of NESCOM, which is the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. As part of that organization, we have, there's a thing called the Permit Modeling Committee. The modelers of all of 8 of the Northeast states. At least the senior modeler, if not all the modelers, are members of that committee. We for several years we meet as in having a conference call quarterly, but recently we have stepped that up to monthly. And as far as the EPA Region 1 and 2 participate in those calls. But in addition, the EPA offers what they refer to as the Regional, State, and Local Modelers Workshop That's an annual event that I usually attend. And I'll have to tell you, I did not attend it this year because I'm here.
For that, we apologize.
Actually, that was last week.
Is New York a member of NESCOM?
Yes,
So in connection with your routine meetings with NESCOM, have you become aware that New York incorporates cumulative risk from multiple sources in the area and the calculation of maximum allowable offsite income?
I'm aware of it. I'm not familiar with their policy, but I have heard them talk about it.
At these meetings?
I would say at the meetings, yeah.
And have you brought that information back to this department to inform your colleagues that a member of NESCOM is evaluating the cumulative risk from multiple sources of air toxics in the calculation of maximum allowable offsite impact?
I'm certain that I've mentioned it on at least one occasion with my direct supervisor,
And who's that?
Mr. Mark Wirt.
How do you spell his last name?
He is W-E-R-T. He is the branch chief of the air planning branch.
And does he report to Section Chief Cushing?
No, he reports to Glenn Keith, I believe.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your testimony earlier that the policy the department has been following is this 1989 policy.
Correct.
Has there been discussion within the department whether to update the policy to something more consistent with what New York is doing?
I have not participated in any of those discussions if they took place.
Sure. So the furthest you've taken that concept is in reporting what New York is doing in modeling the cumulative risk from multiple sources of air toxics to your direct supervisor, Mark Wirt.
Correct.
Bless you. Given your familiarity with how New York is modeling the cumulative impact of nearby sources of air toxics as a result of your attendance at these meetings, did you consider asking the applicant in this case to model nearby sources of air toxics?
I did not,
Why not?
because we follow the policy from 1989.
If I could turn your attention to.
I'm just going to interrupt you
Oh,
for
sure.
one moment. I don't think the witness heard your objection.
I
So,
didn't either.
so I'll just, if you could make your objections louder, and if you hear an objection, don't answer the question until there's a ruling. I barely heard it, so. Proceed, please.
Thank you. If I could turn your attention, Mr. Pacheco, to paragraph 25 of your rebuttal testimony, please. This pertains to the shoreline fumigation,
Yes,
and you explain why you set the distance of the shoreline in your analysis at 1.2 kilometers?
I know when I did the modeling, I did not use that distance.
And I apologize, is your testimony incorrect?
No, my testimony is not incorrect. Would you like me to explain
Please.
my rationale? I do believe, as I believe Mr. Fiskus had testified, that it's not an easy task to finding the shoreline in this area. And I think, people can have various opinions on that. My best estimate of the shoreline that I described in paragraph 25 is 1.2 kilometers based on where what I refer to as the bay waters of Quincy and Hingham Bay reach the shore. That's kind of looking at the shoreline and trying to visualize something that would represent a smooth shoreline. And it's also based on the fact that you have to consider, where the air, the sea breeze circulation would have its origins. That being said, the modeling that I did not use the 1.2 kilometer distance, because what I attempted to do, or what I did do, was start with the distance that Dr. Norgard had used and increased it incrementally. When I went from 145 meters to 200 meters, and then the intent was to increment it by 100 meters per run. But when I got to 300 meters, I got the output from the model telling me that the plume height was not of the Tibble. We, I think, have defined what the Tibble is in earlier testimony. At that point, I modeled 400 just to verify I would get the same result, and then I went to a half a mile, or 800 meters, to verify the same result, and then I stopped. Had I gone to 1.2 kilometers, I would have got the same result.
Fair enough. So am I understanding that up to a distance of 300 meters, you agree with Dr. Nordgaard's analysis, and beyond 300 meters, you believe that the modeling does not support Dr. Nordgaard's conclusion regarding shoreline fumigation?
What is his, I need his conclusion stated.
You were talking about plume height exceeding, what was the word?
Tibble,
Tibble. What does that stand for?
thermal internal boundary layer.
Thank you. So you agree that the plume height exceeds the thermal internal boundary layer up to a distance of 300 meters?
In order to get a result on a air screen, it has to exceed the Tibble.
Well, regardless of why, you agree that it does?
Yes,
So the shoreline fumigation effect would be realized because the plume height exceeds the thermal internal boundary layer out to 300 meters.
correct.
Now, do you recall the question about whether to use a rural or urban dispersion coefficient in the modeling?
Yes,
And the applicant relied on national land cover data from 2003, I believe it was?
1992.
Oh, thank you. 1992. All right. And there was more recent national land cover data from 2011, correct?
There is.
And you see that map included in Mr. Singleton's pre-filed direct testimony?
I'm seeing it in color for the first time.
No, let me hand it to you. And for the record, this is Frank Singleton's pre-filed direct testimony. Just above paragraph, what number, Mr. Pacheco?
7.
Just above paragraph 7. Mr. Pacheco, why wasn't the more recent national land cover data map used for purposes of determining rural versus urban coefficient?
Because in the regulatory process of dispersion modeling, which is governed by Appendix W, we are required, and the other guidance document covering this is the Air Mod Implementation Plan. Those require that you use air surface, and the current version of air surface when this work was done could only handle 1990.
When-
1992.
When was the work done?
Well, again, various pieces starting in 2015, 2016, and 2018.
So several years after the national land cover data that's described in Frank Singleton's testimony?
Correct.
But the program just couldn't use that information?
That's correct.
And am I understanding correctly that a 3-kilometer radius is drawn around the project site?
Correct.
And then you evaluate the pixels within that 3-kilometer area to determine whether it's majority urban or majority rural?
The cells, correct.
This helps, thank you. And is the reason why the rural determination was reached is because there's so much water around the project site?
That's part of it, that's one of the reasons.
And there's certainly water within 300 meters of the project site, correct?
Yes,
A fair amount.
yes,
So there's a fair amount of shoreline within 300 meters of the project site.
there's a fair amount of riverbank around 300 meters of the site. The riverbank,
It's interesting you say that because in a parallel proceeding, we've had quite a bit of discussion about where the riverbank ends.
and I'm not privy to those.
Fair enough. Fair. In the interest of time, Mr. Pacheco, I appreciate your answering our questions. That is all I have.
Any redirect, Mr. Dingle?
Just one question, Mr. Pacheco. Is it fair to say you did not consider shoreline fumigation in your analysis?
What I require of the applicant?
Yes.
Correct.
Why not?
Because despite being in Appendix W, as rightfully pointed out in the testimony of a couple of the petitioner's witnesses, in my career on the private side and working for MassDEP for the last 6 years, and being involved in the modeling of multiple shoreline facilities, including several major sources that required not a non-major comprehensive plan approval, but a comprehensive major source plan approval and ESD permit. That particular issue never came up. And I am aware that it's in Appendix W, and I am also aware that Airmark cannot duplicate the meteorological processes required to model it using Airmark. I've had modeling of major sources approved by the EPA without comment on shoreline fumigation. So it was a matter of professional judgment. Haven't been asking for it.
And this project is not a major source.
No, this is a minor source.
Just one brief follow-up, Ms. Rothschild. Mr. Pacheco, thank you. The fact that you have not modeled shoreline fumigation before is not a controlling reason to prevent you from asking an applicant to model it in the future when circumstances warrant.
Correct.
And that's the same for modeling nearby sources of air toxins.
Modeling nearby
Objection,
sources.
Objection.
what we just were on shoreline fumigation. Sorry. We're jumping in like others' space.
You
What's the objection?
switch from shoreline fumigation to another matter, object to the quick conversion in the same sentence.
Sustained, if you could break that up into 2 questions.
Absolutely. So I'm going to ask you the same question twice about 2 different models. First question, your past practice in not requiring an applicant to model shoreline fumigation is not a controlling reason that prevents you from asking an applicant in the future to model shoreline fumigation when circumstances justify it.
Correct.
And new question, your past practice in not requiring an applicant to model air toxics from nearby sources is not a controlling factor that prevents you from asking an applicant in the future from modeling nearby sources of air toxics when circumstances justify.
And the circumstances that would justify would be a change in department policy.
You agree with me?
Objection.
What's the objection?
Well, I think he's asking a different question, whether it was up to him to make the change.
Could you read back the question and the answer, please?
The last question. And new question, your past practice in not requiring an applicant to model air toxics from nearby sources is not a controlling factor that prevents you from asking an applicant in the future from modeling nearby sources of air toxics when circumstances justify it. The answer I have is in the circumstances that would justify, and the circumstances that would justify would be a change in department policy. Question, you agree with me? And there was the objection.
Sustained.
Okay. Mr. Pacheco, if the department changed its policy and allowed for modeling of air toxics of nearby sources, you would abide by that policy?
Certainly.
No further questions.
Any,
I'm
sorry, Mr. Goldrosen, my apologies.
Follow up on, I believe Mr. Dingle's redirect question to you was whether you had, why not consider, or did you consider requiring shoreline fumigation of the applicant? Did you actively consider requiring it at the time of the decisions on what to include in the modeling?
No.
Because my understanding is fair to say it wasn't your standard practice, and so it didn't come up. Is that fair? But let me rephrase it. So you said you did not consider it at the time, is that correct?
Correct.
And is that because it was not something that customarily you would have required of an applicant under these conditions?
Correct.
That's all.
Anything further from the petitioners? Any redirect from the department? Thank you, Mr. Pacheco. Let's take a 10-minute break before the next meeting, if you will.
You thought it was the next
Oh, I wasn't sure.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that was supposed to be tagged.
Hey, it's so you know, I don't wanna